Right. It says it's gone blue, so hopefully we're going live. I see 3 people. This is good. This is exciting.
I see 24.
Uh-oh. What?
24 waiting.
Ah, awesome. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully these two won't stay silent. Make some noise.
Hey.
Meow.
That'll do. Did you hear the wonderful vocal stylings? So we've got Erin on stream tonight. Just jump straight in. We have officially launched Advanced Geometry Nodes for 3.3 and upwards. Erin's put his heart and soul into this, and first of all, I want to do a big shout out to everybody who's pre-ordered, because thank you very much. We can see how excited you were about it, and if you did pre-order, it is now available for you, and you can start diving in. But please join in the stream as well. You know, multitask with it, perhaps after the stream.
Yep.
But we are going to.
I want to say hi to 4K and Roderick and Pers and Erasure, and wonder why I'm looking so blurry. I think I'm just misbehaving.
That's on you. Erin's crisp. I'm crisp. Well, I'm local, so that's
Erin
fine.
is crisp.
That makes sense.
Nice.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe I'm just a blurry person. Sorry.
I'm still getting over my cough. I'll try not to do it directly into the microphone to save people's ears. But yeah, absolutely fantastic. It is now live. I will be a tiny bit distracted at the beginning because there are a few things that I can't do all at the same time. And making sure that the course is now live is the first one that's done. For those who wanting to check it out, hopefully that's still in my buffer. There we go. You can go to that link there, and that will take you to the course. Now, during the pre-sale for it all, for the pre-order, we were running a massive 40% off. So thank you for everybody diving in there. We are still going to run a little bit of a sale for the launch week. We always do. It's going to be the equivalent of 20% off. So it will be $10 off the list price plus whatever your taxes are in your country. So I'm really excited to see what people are going to make of this. And we're going to go through this evening, and we're going to chat about geometry nodes in general, just chill. If you guys have any questions, just ask away in the chat, and we'll field those as they come in. Can't wait.
Mostly there's a whole lot of highs and great to see everybody's. We do have Selk too saying, why do I see hashtag Godot and hashtag made with Godot tags? Because we're all waiting for Godot. I don't know. Mikey did it.
Oh,
I think they're left over from last week when I was doing Godot stuff.
The standard. Oh, I should put in some other hashtags in there. Yes, we're still getting the hang of our live streams. We've only been doing it 2 years or so.
We've got time still, don't worry.
So, Erin, welcome to the
So
show.
why don't we start right at the beginning?
Yeah. Go on then, Yen.
I was going to say, hey, welcome, Erin. It's not his first course for us, and it's not his first geometry course for us, but just for folks who are just tuning in and not quite sure, Erin, what's a geometry node?
So geometry nodes is Blender's procedural modeling side of things. So if you're familiar with Houdini, or if you're from the CAD background, you might have used Grasshopper. So it's basically node-based mesh generation. Which is amazing because it means that a lot of the stuff that we do all the time with our modeling, like doing an extrusion, you can suddenly do that, like you can do a test version of it. And then maybe you're saying every face which points upwards is going to go be extruded. And then you can go and just replace your input meshes. So suddenly you're pushing other things through that pipe. It's essentially like a large macro builder system. That's how I think about it. And it allows you to just go crazy. You can make so many things now. And like geometry nodes has been out for a couple of years now. I think 2020, November 2020 was the first node that got released. It was like a Boolean and a transform node, and that was it. And it was just rubbish. But you could do a few things with it. And then they basically remade it. So we did the first geometry nodes course with you guys. That was, I think that was last August. Is that August 21?
Yes. And so that was in Blender 2.93, wasn't it? And
Yeah,
then what did they
2.93.
do for us, for everybody in the Geometry Nodes course? What did they do when version 3 rolled round?
It was so, we were making the course.
Like
and
two months later.
Well, they released the version 2 months later, but we were still like we were making the course, and I was testing the alpha builds of 3.0, and it was just like, this is already obsolete. So there was an awareness that it was coming to an end. But it was an LTS release, so we went with the course anyway. And then obviously we just released the full refresh of that course.
Yep.
So
Yes, so we've got the advanced course is what we're launching today, but we also have a beginner's course. So if you're not up to speed with geometry nodes, we've got a geometry nodes for Blender 3.3. So just a beginner's course. What would you describe that as? Like a Stonehenge with fairies flying? Is it birds now rather than the fairies?
yeah. So the first time we did it, it was like it was like fairy ring mushrooms, and this time it's sort of standing stones and birds, animated birds. And we changed a few things around, so the exercise is a little bit different.
Yeah.
But it's still sort of much of a muchness. The goal is really just to get people down, like feet on the ground, understanding how geometry nodes functions and some of the basic operations of using it. And then that feeds nicely up into the advanced course that we're releasing today. And it's just, yeah, there's a lot more sort of depth that we're going into.
Yes. One of the things, because I've had the luxury and of actually going through the course.
The privilege.
The privilege. That's the word I'm looking for. The luxury of. Yeah, I've had the privilege of going through the course, and one of the things that really stuck out to me is how during the course you actually make your own toolkit. Essentially, they're constantly thinking about putting together systems that you can use again and again and again. I think that's really, really valuable. One of the valuable lessons to take away from the course is the ability to create these node groups that you're going to be able to use in future things. You're not just coming away with, look at this thing I've made. It's look at this thing I've made and these things I can take away with me and use in my own projects.
And that's one of the good things about geometry nodes and just generally like node-based systems is once you've built something once, you haven't really just you haven't just used it once. Like, because it is a series of operations, you can just package that up and use it somewhere else. So one of the things we make really early on is like a noise displacement node. And that's something that you use that all the time, just in general workflow, doing noise displacement, just being able to randomize the surface a bit. And so like going through the process of, we're going to do this noise displacement, but we're also going to just generalize it to make it into a tool rather than it just being this is exactly what we need right now. It's like, make it, generalize it, and then you've got yourself a tool that you can use forever. And that's something that we use like 7, 8, 9 times throughout the rest of the course. So it just saves a lot of effort.
I'm just going.
It's something I've certainly found when doing procedural generation Am I disappearing? I don't even know if I'm still here.
You are still here. You are still here.
I'm doing procedural generation I'm still here. I just keep vanishing. Procedural generation in coding is you're not saving time by writing a bunch of rules to generate content, right? That's not why you're doing it. But once you've got that rule in place and properly generalized, you can then make it much more efficient. You can start making these processes a lot more streamlined. It's a conversation we've had a few times. Like, why would you use procedural generation rather than manual generation? And I guess that's a question I'd ask for you. When would you use geometry nodes rather than manually making meshes?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because it's one that I have been. It's difficult to find the threshold, and it depends on the tool you're using as well. Like, if you're writing stuff in Python, then it's like you can go a lot deeper. In geometry nodes, you're sort of limited to the nodes that they've made. If you're doing something in Python or C or Rust or whatever, and you're building it from the ground up, then you can just make whatever tools you need to do for the project. So I think, partially it's a decision about what tool you're using. But I think as well, like the project, in this course, we don't fully generate everything, because the amount of time that you would need to go through and generate everything for like 3 specific things, like if I was to go and individually make the rocks that go on the surface, and you've got a system that makes like paving slabs or slabs of stone, and it's like, that's quite a lot of work to go through for something that I could just, I don't know, I sculpted a few rocks in about half an hour, decimated them, and then they're done. And it's like, if you can get away with that and then process them procedurally, that's often like a much better use of your time. And I guess you just have to think about it in terms of like, why are you making the work? Like, when it's a lot of my work that I do for myself, I'm doing it because I want to use geometry nodes. So in that case, I'll use geometry nodes to the nth degree, even when it's stupid, even when you're doing stuff which is so hacky and pointless. But it's just fun. Like, I enjoy using the nodes. But when I'm using geometry nodes at work, the amount that I actually manually model is significantly higher, because when it comes into like a production environment, it's like
Right.
you want to have a certain quality baseline guaranteed, and you can do that and feed that into a procedural system, which is essentially accelerating your process, and you're just using it to like scale yourself up. So I guess totally dependent on the individual and what they want to do and the tool they're using. So that's my politician's answer.
And I think that that's kind of key, right? Is that this is a tool that you put in your workflow or in your toolkit, if you want to extend the metaphor. You're not supposed to just use one process for everything, in the same way that you shouldn't just rely on one type of character in a game or anything else you're creating, right? It's something you should be fluent in, and you should know when you want to use it. And when you do want to use it, it's there for you, as opposed to, I must now make all my default cubes in geometry nodes.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, I kind of want to replace
just having
cube with
having a
geometry node now.
breadth. I know it's tempting, isn't it? To have like a breadth of skills is just going to be so much more useful. And I guess it's like, it's just knowing when things are more useful. Like, if you're going to be modeling a thing and you stick a bevel modifier at the end of it, like, that's a procedural system that you're doing. And we all know that we do it because we don't want to create all of that extra geometry, which if we do it, then it's going to make our lives so much more difficult to actually edit the geometry. Whereas, and if you think about geometry nodes in the same kind of way, it's just a slightly further modifier. So you can do deeper things, but at the same time, it's like, is your base model becoming like more complicated? Like in the bridge, we're basing it all on this like initial scaffold, which we build in geometry nodes as well. But you could equally just build like, here is an extrusion that I want my bridge to be this shape, and then you can bridgeify that instead. Like, there's nothing stopping you from doing that and just being like, okay, well, I'm just going to curate this and have that bit of art direction manually.
Yes, it's. I've always looked at procedural generation, whether it's or any coding as well. So in Blender, I've often dived into Python to try and speed up my workflow. But there's always that knife edge where you're like, well, this is a lot of fun, and you can end up spending a lot of time trying out different ways of doing things just for the pleasure of playing with those systems. But one of the things that I realized a few years back now, Jan and I were working on a project, and it required me to export like 50 assets. And by the time you've exported them all individually, like once, you could have written code to do that automatically. And Jan asked me for some changes, and I was like, well, I'm not going to export them all manually again. I write a script, and then every change that I do, I can just click export, and boom, all 50 assets are out, all correctly formatted, aligned, whatever you need to do for the particular export project you're working on. And similar, to Aaron, I've played with these things, and it's you can get carried away with it, and there can be faster ways of doing things. But if you're going to keep reusing something, then it's worth making a procedure from it. Proceduralism, yeah.
But so I'm starting to stop it because I'm aware that there's a decent amount of chat lag between me saying something and you guys hearing it, because I've noticed I keep talking over Aaron. I'm not trying to. But if you keep going,
Jan, go.
It's because my screen Mikey stopped talking. There is something to be said for, I like this technique, I'm just going to play with it. Because that's a great way to learn. It's not necessarily a great way to get professional content done, whether that's making games or 3D scenes or characters or whatever it might be. But the amount of projects we've had that just started from, I just feel like playing with navigation nodes for 2 weeks. I'm just going to do that, or particles, or something else. And you find yourself becoming fluent in them, I think is how I would look at it.
Yeah, definitely.
Question from CrossMod. If I'm already okay at geometry nodes, will I be able to go through the course before Modvember starts?
November,
not Modvember.
Yeah,
November.
So this is a classic question of, where does beginner and intermediate and advanced actually sit? But I'll let Aaron speak about the course itself.
I know me and Mike have had a lot of discussions about intermediate versus beginner versus advanced, and it is very difficult to know, like if you've made content. So the way that I'm seeing this course is, if you're a complete beginner, you will struggle, but you should still be able to actually follow and click through and reach the same result. Like, I don't think there's anywhere in there that is like a beginner at this point would just get lost. Like, I think as long as you're sort of watching and clicking along, I think they would, you know, be able to follow through. And I think, you know, like intermediate and advanced people, there's a lot of like filling in the gaps that you can do at that point. So I definitely think that, and I know Crossmod, I know your work, like absolutely you can do that. You've got 8 days. You will nail it. You can probably go through the course in like 2-3 days. You'll be fine. But yeah, I think to get the most out of the course, I think a person would probably want to do it over, you know, maybe a week. There's 34 videos in it, so it's not a super short course.
Yes, it is several hours of content. That for you to get your teeth in. It covers so much as well. It feels like it covers a lot in a short space, but it is absolutely jam packed with information. I know, as I've been through it, I've actually stopped, and I'm a big fan of not trying to plow through content, because you don't really absorb it if you go really quickly through. So what I tend to do with a lot of courses when I take them, I actually sit down, I watch the lecture, maybe a couple of lectures, depending on if it's, you know, if it's covering a broader thing, and then I will sit down and I go, oh, that's really cool. Can I now try? And I know Erin at the beginning of the course says, save your file, go off and play with this, see if you can work it out. Just try some things. And to quote Bob Ross, happy accidents. You know, the number of times that I've done something, I'm like, that's cool. It wasn't what I intended, but that is really cool. And that happens so often with geometry nodes. You plug something in the wrong way, and it's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that,
I mean, learning from
one of you.
Sorry, go ahead, Jan. Jan, you go.
Learning from messing around and doing the wrong thing can be great if you sort of sit there and go, why did that happen? Right? If you then learn from the mistake, if you go in and go, oh, that's wrong, and just go back, you haven't actually learned from it. So by all means, play with stuff. Erin, you go.
I was going to say something similar, actually. The playing is so valuable in terms of just naturally finding solutions. Like I mean, all the three of us here are course makers, so I don't want to say anything tactless. But like
it's a safe place. Just pretend it's just us three. It's fine.
The value of a course and of content is when you go off piste. Like it should go. If you just watch a video through and you follow exactly what the tutor is doing, and you get to the end of it and you haven't engaged or thought about it, and the point was just that you reached the same conclusion as the tutor, fine. You know, you probably have learnt something in that process. But it's when you run up against a stone wall and you're like, I have no idea how to get over this. I'm not going to just copy the answer. I'm not going to just get exactly the solution and go for that, because that's not going to help you develop. But as soon as you're like, I'm just going to test a bunch of stuff and see why this works, and like once you've got the solution, look at it and just be like, why did that work? Like, why this, not that? And I think sometimes, especially with procedural systems, you can often find patterns in stuff. Like quite a lot of times, and this happened to me a couple of days ago, I was doing like a modulo of something, of like an index, and it was like I just plugged in an integer into the bottom and I was just testing values because I had no idea what the pattern was going to be. And I was just testing values until I found something that worked, and it was like, oh, 7 works. What do I know about my system that is 7? And it's like, oh, okay, I can just grab a domain size from over here that I know is 7 things coming in, and then it's like it starts piecing itself together. It's like, well, if there's 7 of these, then obviously now I know, like now in retrospect, I can see that pattern. But when you're actually working through, it can be a bit abstract sometimes. So going off piste and playing and trying stuff and then actually having a moment to analyze why something worked can just make you so much better at what you do, and regardless of what it is, whether that's proceduralism or coding or making music. Like if you find something that works and you work out why it works,
yeah, it's one of the ways for deep learning to really kick in is when you take the content and run with it. And that's really what I mean. I always love seeing that, is when people take the course that I'm making, but don't make that game, or they make that game and then they try it a different way, or they try it with different assets or a different theme. Just because when you start applying this to your own life, or what educators call metacognition, that's when you start making those deep connections. And it's kind of the difference between memorizing lines from a phrase book and trying new things in a different language to see what sticks. They're both good ways of learning, but you learn them in a very different way.
Yeah. Just to build on top of learning styles and things like that, I've always likened. I like food, which is a shame, but I do like food. So following along with someone else's recipe is a great way of, cooking a bit of food. You end up with the same thing, hopefully, when you're following the cook along, and you become a great cook. If you do want to take it a step further, you really do have to go outside and experiment, and you will have failures. You will have massive success, you'll have massive failures, and that's when you start to become more of a chef. You're no longer just following a recipe, you're creating your own things. And sometimes your own monstrosities as well, but that's absolutely fun. Failure is part of the learning process, and I hope across all of our courses, I know that Jan says it and Erin said it, it's all about playing and experimenting and having happy accidents and having failures, and learning from those failures is kind of like the most important thing. And of course, if you ever need a hand, then go help, and we've got a lovely community of people to dive in and help.
I am reminded of a thing I was watching today, the new trailer for Kerbal Space Program 2, which I wasn't that excited about because I've never played Kerbal Space Station 1, but Kerbal Space Station, yeah, we'll go with that.
That'll do. Roll with it.
The lead designer had a phrase right at the beginning, which was, not only is failure an option, it's mandatory.
Yeah.
Like, we want to make mistakes and we want to learn from them. Like, if the moment you're okay doing that, taking the content and making it your own, making mistakes and learning from it, like, realistically, what's the worst you're going to do? Like, unless you're doing this on, NORAD's nuclear safety computer, you're probably not going to do any real damage. So have fun with it.
I am super excited for Kerbal Space Program. I've been watching it, and that's it's a great ethos that they've got there. And if you've ever played the game, you'll know that it is about experimentation. It's about just trying things, and hilarity ensues because you often end up going down a whole it's a story generator, and the same if you're going through a course and you're creating things as you're going through, you're going to discover things that you never knew before as you go through.
But those mistakes.
And hi,
as well,
Curtis.
Oh yeah, hi Curtis. Those mistakes, when he's saying like making mistakes is mandatory, that's like when you don't make mistakes and you've arrived at a solution, you are so like almost vulnerable because you don't know why you got there. You've made the right decisions, but there's no reason that you couldn't just go back and break it. Like, I've been doing coding recently. I've been trying to learn Python for the last couple of weeks, and sometimes I'll be like, oh my god, it's amazing, I'm having so much fun, this works, and then I'll change something and then I won't have any idea why it's broken, and it's like, I swear this was exactly the same before. But it's because,
or worse, you learn it like a recipe. And this is, sorry, the lag's doing this. I don't mean to be talking over you. It's a way we sometimes differentiate internally in our company between recipes and tutorials, right? A recipe is, I want to do this effect. I'll walk you through it. And that's great. And every time you want to do that effect, this will work. But what if you want to do something slightly different? That's when you need a tutorial. That's when you need to learn the why it works.
Yeah.
And a great way of learning the why is to make the mistakes, is to play with it.
Yeah. The classic one for the blender
I should have some sort of visual signal.
Me, sir. Nice speak. One of the classic ones in the Blender space has got to be Andrew Price's Blender Guru, his donut. And you see it hundreds of times. Someone's got a torus, they put a displacement on it. So at that point, you've learned how to add an object, you've learned how to displace a model. Oh, cool. But if you're very, very new, you're like, I mean, can I try that on this? And you're like, oh, I can make a bumpy log. So, but that's only for those who feel, so I say brave enough to go off the path and experiment really, really early on. But I think going through tutorials is a great way of learn the sort of recipe type tutorials is a great way of learning Blender and where things are in the interface. Being able to just know where things are, knowing where the tools are in your kitchen, so to speak. But then you've got where you just need to go that little bit further. You're like, oh, how do I go forward from here? And experimentation is the key with that.
It's also become kind of a running joke that, you know, when someone's learning Blender, because they start showing you pictures of donuts.
Yeah,
Like, it's great. It's a great way to learn. It's a great
that's
project.
fantastic.
But
Yeah.
go beyond that. What else can you do with it?
Yeah, a lot of
Now I
people
want
do end up
donuts.
in tutorial jail. In tutorial jail because they get stuck here making donuts, and it's like if you don't push beyond that, and if the tutorial doesn't necessarily invite you to, I think sometimes, like for beginners especially, having that like invitation to say like, oh, okay, this bit now I've been told to go and have a think about this piece, or I've been told to just try a different texture in my displacement or something like that. It's like, here is a safe place for you to just test something and get it wrong and be invited to get it wrong.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us as adult learners as well, like we haven't been bad at something for so long. Like we
will avoid it if we can.
exactly.
If we can, yeah.
You start going to work and you get into your tropes and your workflows and you do that. And then like for loads of us, if we were to go and try and learn violin or something, now it's like we can't even hold it. Like that's I can't use I didn't realize I couldn't use my body. That's not something that I've realized. But then as soon as you start realizing that you have to be a learner again, you have to be bad at something again.
Yeah.
That is a skill unto itself. So I think that's part of coming into like tutorials. And I think a lot of people now, especially with the lockdown for the last few years and COVID and people shifting around careers and priorities and, you know, CGI becoming a lot bigger, and people are moving more towards learning 3D. And I think all of us have seen quite big growth in our sort of teaching in this space. And there's a lot of people who are moving into it from, you know, not as young people and not as learners in other areas. They're just like, I want a career change. I'm going to learn Blender because it's free. And it's like, wow, yeah.
That's one of the great things about Blender. It is free, and I think despite we all have our woes with it when the area that we like in Blender isn't quite up to date. I mean, my bug with Blender's got to be like its particle system and its simulation system. It works, but you always feel like you're fighting it because I know it's on their list for things to improve. I'm chomping at the bit to do so. Often what happens with Blender is they end up with a project. So the Blender Foundation will be doing an open movie. Sprite Fright was the last one. And that pushes part of Blender forward because they use it in a more production-like environment. We just need one with simulation now. We'll be there.
At the moment, they're doing the one with Eevee, aren't they? They're developing Eevee Next.
Eevee Next,
which is they're supposedly more realistic. I don't know. I haven't really been following it too closely. Are they doing ray tracing as part of it? Are they doing like a combined render engine?
I don't know. It'd be good if they integrated the path tracing type stuff that RTX and similar have provided, and maybe even a denoising situation in there so they can approximate it and then maybe blur it out. Which is kind of how RTX works. But I don't know if that's what they are doing. But
and because the whole thing for this new open movie, I can't remember the name of it, is that they're going to do the, like, it's supposed to be realistic real time, and I'm keen to see how they managed to make that land. But there was a lot of like the hair nodes being development, or the new hair system was developed basically for that.
Yeah, I know with a lot of artists.
I see a couple of comments like being bad is one. Sorry.
No, go for it, Jan. I can say mine in a bit.
No, there was like a 2-second silence. I'm like, this is a good time to do it. And I start talking and I get 3 seconds in and Mikey's still going. I'm like, now I look like a twit. Seeing a couple of comments like being bad is one skill I sell at Blender, which, you know, it's not a serious comment. I understand that. And sucking at something is the first step towards being sort of good at something. It goes back to that question of what is intermediate and what is expert. And I think it's not a binary. It's like learning a language or a musical instrument, right? You're fluent in that bit.
Mm-hmm.
You get good at this area. You sort of build up the expertise in a much more organic way. It's not like you flip a switch and suddenly you're king of Blender nodes or queen of Godot or emperor of Python. It's you've now learned this technique, which you can apply in all kinds of creative ways. So being bad at something is great because it allows you to develop that.
And it allows you to get better
Staying
at
bad
it
at
as well.
something, yeah, staying bad at something is not so good. But I'm bad at this, so I'm going to keep practicing. It's great. That was my thing. Over.
Being aware of what you're bad at. Like as soon as you can see it and you're aware that this is my thing that could really use a little bit of polish.
Yeah.
Like if you can see it, then that's great as well, because there's a lot of people who could use a little bit of polish who don't necessarily realize it. And great that they're enjoying what they're doing, but I think it takes also a little bit of, awareness to continue up the ladder.
Yeah, definitely. I've worked
Yeah, get rid of the old
alongside
Dunning-Kruger effect. Get rid of the, oh, this is easy. I understand this. Like, be aware what you've got to learn.
I've checked out so I don't know if Melicon's in the chat. He's usually in the background anyway watching, but chap Melicon, he does a lot of like Star Wars stuff and a lot of hard surface spaceship stuff. It absolutely brilliant looking at his work, and one of the things that I pushed him with was spending more than like a day modeling on something, because art takes time sometimes, and sometimes the reason why what you're doing isn't quite at the level you want it to is because you haven't actually spent that extra hour on it, whether that's just in compositing at the very end, or just or not focusing. You focus all your time on modeling and you don't bother texturing and you don't bother lighting something properly. All these are actually individual skills, so being good at one doesn't make you bad at another. It just means that there's another pillar of knowledge you've got to start working on, and you can get halfway there very quickly by simple lighting tricks,
and I would even
like
say
3-point lighting, etc. Go.
I would even say the people I know who are the best at certain things or certain techniques within a program or whatever it is are the ones who are keenly aware how much they've got to learn. Like you develop a sense of expertise, but almost everyone I know who's good at, let's say, making tutorials has imposter syndrome, right? But there's these bits I'm not good at. I think the students are going to be really unhappy and see through me. Like, it's not, aha, I've done it. I am the best in the world. I've learned this bit. I'm comfortable with this. I want to teach this bit. But there might be another part that you just, you want to improve at.
Absolutely. One of the things I will do briefly, because obviously people have joined in since then. This is Erin in the middle. You probably know him. We've just launched a brand new course, an advanced course for geometry nodes. In a few moments, I'm going to go not through it exactly, but we'll chat about what's in the course as well. We do have a launch week special, which is about 20% off, and you can get it in the link. Have I still got it in here? No. I'll have to go put the link in. Otherwise, it won't work. So I'll paste the link in a moment. So when it comes to the advanced course, we've actually got a beginner's course that's sort of complementary to that and acts as a springboard. So if you're not confident with geometry nodes, there's a great place to start there. But the advanced course, we talked a little bit earlier about creating toolkits that you can reuse. But when you were putting this course together, what would you say was your sort of like genesis point of like, I really want to teach this? Because I know we also go over SDFs in there, and I didn't realize quite the power of those. And I was like, oh,
SDFs
this
are
is amazing.
Do you know PSVR Dreams? That people make all those experiences in Dreams on PSVR. You might have seen them. That entire modeling experience is done with SDFs. Like their whole system is voxelized SDFs. And if you've ever done any VR sculpting, and you're just like you're painting out those blobs in 3D space, that's all voxelized. They basically like you can make these SDF stamps, and you can like. So anyway, yeah, SDFs they're amazing. I love SDFs, and because it's all just maths as well. Like that
it computes
shouldn't.
So quick.
Yeah, exactly.
In theory,
you don't need to be. It's when you mesh it that's the computation. That's when it takes time. And I did a stream on YouTube the other day that was, sorry, I will get back to your question. I did a stream on YouTube the other day that was making a Colosseum, like the Colosseum with SDFs. And it was all just basically taking your XYZ coordinate space, which is kind of already gradients. If you split it up into their individual channels, you have this linear gradient in space. And you can just start doing maths to that. And a little bit of maths goes a very long way, and you can start creating very complex shapes, cutting other shapes out of it as SDFs, as signed distance functions. So they're essentially just gradients. So yeah, you can just take SDFs to the nth degree, really. And the only computation is then when you have to compute the mesh surface. Otherwise, you're just adding numbers together, and it's really quick because you're just, computers are very good at saying what is 2 plus 3, or what's the maximum of 5 and 6. Well, it's going to be 6, and they know that very quickly. So you were saying the genesis of this course exercise. So is this asking where I got the idea for the bridge, or just why I wanted to do the course,
or just which is your favorite Genesis song?
Yeah, that might. What is no, I can't dance. I can't. That's a Genesis, isn't it? I don't know. Anyway, what was the question? No, so the genesis of the course. So I know we spoke a lot about the different things that we could potentially do as projects, because ultimately whatever we want to do, we want it to be in project form, so you're actually going through and you've got end goals, whether it's micro projects as you go through or just an overarching project, then you're actually working towards something as you go through. And we had discussed, building generator or this, that, and the other, and everyone under the sun's done a building generator by now. And I was like, let's look at something else. And then when you showed me the bridge, I was like, there's those really cool bridges in forests.
Yeah, the bridges are awesome. I mean, when I first saw the pictures of bridges, the bridges, so there's, I'm losing my words. There's a place in North India where they make these incredible bridges that they train these specific type of trees over like gaps that they need to move between, because they have like a certain elasticity to the roots that makes them very suitable to bearing loads and being able to sort of, you basically train them all together and they make a sort of basket and you can fill it with mud and they just grow out of the mud basically. And then you have these self-sustaining bridges, which is just incredible, and they're just the most surreal things from somebody from the north of England. This is just the most incredible thing. So seeing that was, first of all, just really inspiring, but also it's like Geometry Nodes is pretty good at making organic stuff. So there's like, what you can do a lot of stuff with like building generators and being very specific about like this module is this size and you can have 5 of them in a row and now you've got a shop front. And it's like there's just a lot more to Geometry Nodes that a lot of people aren't using it for. Building generators are cool, but you're essentially just scattering objects.
Yes.
You're making a grid instead of randomly distributing. So by the time you've been through the beginner tutorial, excuse me, then you know how to scatter stuff. Like you kind of know how to make a building. It's just a bit more maths. So to be able to go through and find a project like the live root bridge, where it's like you can do SDF workflow, we can do the shortest path workflow, we can do touching on how to make trees, although perhaps not in an optimal process. I would definitely recommend people look into L systems.
I was going to jump in and say L systems for doing that, but that's a limitation of Geometry Nodes at the moment with looping, isn't it?
Got no loops, exactly. So there's, you can make a node group, and I did this. So before we got the shortest path node, I was hoping to get this course out during August. That was my plan, and the nodes just weren't really there while I was planning the course. And then they added the shortest path node, and it was like, now we can do all of the shortest path stuff, do all of the routes with that, and then I can just use a simplified method of creating the trees, which works fine for the sort of the style of the exercise. But yeah, it's just, as soon as you have an exercise where you can do a lot of things, because I've planned other courses, and there was a course I released a year ago that was on StirChalk, which is a procedural modeling procedural modeling node-based tool, like add-on for Blender. It's all essentially Python nodes. Anyway, it's amazing add-on. It has about 700 nodes. You can do a huge amount with it, but it's not very fast because it's Python. And I made a course for that which I'm very proud of, but it was like 5 or 6 different exercises. It was like, let's make a pavilion, let's do a roof here, and let's do another facade, or something like that, where it's individual exercises but very piecemeal. And I wanted for it to be like, individual sections. We have the bit where we're like, okay, let's introduce SDFs, and then we're going to learn about the SDFs, and then let's introduce the shortest path nodes, and then we're going to work through using the shortest path nodes. And the same for the accumulate. We did that where we introduce the accumulate, show you all how to use it, and then we actually apply it to our project. So it's much more like trying to get here's the general lesson, here's how you can apply it to a project. Here's the general lesson, here's how you can apply it to a project. And use it in a much more, trying to get something that was a bit more scalable. And so that's kind of where the exercise lent itself to being flexible like that.
It's pretty awesome. The end result, I was very surprised. And I correct me if I'm wrong. I'm very surprised at how long you go for without really seeing the final thing, and then bang, it's there and it's all working. And I found when I've been playing around with geometry nodes that you kind of halfway there, and then you're there. There seems to be this huge, great big leap between what you're trying to put together, and then once all of these systems are together, bang, you can link them all together, and suddenly you've got your final piece. I mean, I've been through like the, as you say, the building generator thing myself, where you're simply doing a bit of maths and working stuff out, and you end up at the end with a lovely building, but it's only at that final moment that it all just comes together and seems to work. Jan, he's over that side.
Okay, this might not come through because the storm outside is killing my internet. We have a question. Using geometry nodes to generate the environment and converting it to a game asset sounds interesting, but what would the workflow look like?
Interesting, because Erin covers that right at the very end of the course. We start talking about, right, if you want this as a game asset, because it's, how many polys was it, like 2.1 million or something crazy?
Yeah, and the problem with proceduralism is it's very easy to turn things up. Like you've got a system, and then it's like, well, this could just, it's 4 now, but it would be smoother if I made it 30. And then not really registering that that's not like a linear extreme. Like you're not just turning it up tenfold, you're turning it up 1,000-fold, because that's like you're working 3D space here. So yeah, it's very easy to let things get completely out of control, but it's also very easy to process stuff. We have a lot of like people don't give Blender enough credit for its decimation tool. Like the decimate modifier is very capable, really good at preserving topology. So I think, the process at the moment is not the prettiest for converting stuff into game assets. But if you're breaking stuff up, so this bridge, for example, if I was doing it knowing it was going to be a game asset, I would have actually made it out of several different objects, and I would have split the node tree up. And there is a little bit of there's a little bit of thinking before you can sort of re-engineer a node tree to be that way. You just have to think about like where the information needs to fork off, and then you can use that in different places. Basically, you can work out where your inputs are. So if you have 4 outputs, you might actually have 1 extra input section which branches to each of these 4 output objects and acts as like the source object. Perhaps this would be worth having an additional tutorial on how to re-engineer node trees. So I'll maybe write that one down. But essentially, you can mark sections off. You can preserve stuff by marking it as an instance in Blender. So, for example, at the end of the course, we take the bridge, we mark everything as instances, or set everything to be an instance, except from the base structure, which is the really high poly section. So that is still being recognized as a mesh. And then we can put it through a decimate modifier, and the decimate modifier will only see the part of it that you've left as a mesh. So you can basically selectively decimate, or selectively bevel, or selectively remesh, or whatever operation it is that you want to do based on that. And then you can pull it back into geometry nodes afterwards. If you've stored booleans on different things as well, and this is what I do quite a lot of work, is I store booleans on stuff, and then I process it through a modifier, because modifiers are useful, like the bevel and things like that. And then you can split it back out, filter it for the next boolean you want to do, and put another modifier on that
Yeah.
afterwards. And again, just like instantiate some parts, break it apart, reinstantiate other parts, and just working in that kind of way is not the prettiest, but as we get more nodes added, it will become more and more viable to have that kind of workflow. And certainly, I think for 3.4, they're going to be, so that's the next version of Blender, they're going to be, hopefully, touch wood, supporting more UVs natively. So you'll be able to just, at the moment, and we do cover this in the course, you have to go through a bit of a conversion process with UVs when you apply the modifier. But for 3.4 and beyond, you should just be able to say this bit of this attribute is going to be a UV map, and then you can keep everything live. So yeah, I would say you can definitely make game assets now. And if you're planning on doing it, if you have something particular in mind, then let's have a chat on Discord, and we can work out an actual specific workflow for your situation, because it's always there's always a general solution, and then there's usually a better solution for your specific task. So
one of the things we were doing for the action RPG, I've made a procedural weapons course where you make the pommel of a sword, the handle of the sword, maybe the guard of the sword, and the actual blade of the sword. You actually make the assets, and then through a bit of geometry nodes plus Python, iterating around all of those objects and creating. Here you go, Jan. Here's his 500 game ready assets. They were already low
My
poly,
favorite
so
being the giant battle axe with a little dagger handle. That was amazing.
it was like Thor's hammer, but
Like,
in
we didn't check
Ballax.
them first, we just put them in. There is a question from Nick. Erindale, what is the output of your Erindale node tree logo on Discord?
oh, you mean the server banner?
Yeah.
So for people who don't know, I have my own Discord server. I say it's my own, but it's sort of become like the Blender procedural community. I just eponymously named. So we ran a competition where people could design the server banner, and there is a very beautiful server banner, which is just Erindale spelled out with nodes. I think somebody took their actual node tree and reorganized all of the nodes, which is why you can see there's so many connections.
Yeah.
And they basically just were like, yeah, this will do for the server banner. So the requirement for the server banner competition was that it had to be an image that you've made with nodes. And when I wrote that, I was thinking people need to make things procedurally. And then this person came back and was like, I made it with nodes, it's nodes. I was like, oh, okay, that's thinking outside the box. I like that.
So for Erin's server, I'll just post that in because I hope for some reason I can invite. So there we go. There's an invite link for Erin's server. I can't. If Erin does it, it just gets blocked by YouTube because reasons.
Indeed. Hi, Killing Smalls, welcome.
Oh, excuse me. So yeah, absolutely fantastic what we can do with geometry nodes. What part of geometry nodes at the moment are you absolutely loving that you just can't put down? You use it day in, day out.
Oh, SDFs.
It's gotta be it.
SDFs. There's nothing you can't make with it. If you can do the maths, you can do the SDFs. And it's not difficult maths as well. It's just like minimum, maximum, basically. And that's very simple to kind of logic your way through. Like if you've got two gradients going in opposite directions and you take the maximum, it's just going to take the highest value from at each point. And if you take the minimum, it's going to take the lowest value from each point. So if you have an SDF, which I know I keep saying SDF without ever explaining it, an SDF is a signed distance function. So the SDF of a sphere would essentially be a gradient that all comes out from a single point and it goes from some value. And the surface of that we call an isosurface, and that is where the gradient is equal to 0. And then it's just a distance. It's a linear gradient. So moving 1 in that direction will change the gradient value by 1.
So there's a procedural artist I can't remember his name, but he's done like this girl in the snow with a fence panel going
amazing.
along. And it's absolutely amazing, and that's, I believe, made with SDFs. It's where I first came across the term myself being used in an art world. I was like,
yeah,
wow, the fact that you you've got this sphere, and then you put two spheres against the head to do a Boolean operation. Say, well, there's nothing there, and it's just adding
Yeah.
and subtracting and adding and subtraction. Before you know it, you've got this incredible character, and it's okay. It's maths, and it looks scary. And I wanted to touch upon the whole. You mentioned maths, and like half the
Mm.
audience goes, "What?" And yes, it can take a while to get your head around. And one of the things that I've both loved about getting into, and it's actually Blender got me into coding using Python, because I was like, well, how am I going to do this? Because I don't want to click this thing 1,000 times. And so that got me into the coding side of things. And then when I was playing around with, before Geometry Nodes was around, a lot of the other maths that we kind of played with but didn't maybe internalize as maths would have been our materials, our shader graph.
Mhm.
And then you take a step back and you're like, multiply the divide. These are all maths terms. I'm doing maths. I've been tricked into doing it. And it's what's one of the great things about Blender is you can have that visual input as to what the maths is actually doing. I've struggled a couple of times when the maths is beyond 1 and less than 0. So it's just either black or white. Your hand's over Erin's head. I can just see that your shoulder is now. You're like, go for it, Jan.
Well, you should be able to see all three cameras, but
Nope.
hopefully the
Just
thunder
monitor
won't kick
the
in.
screen.
We have a question. Now, I'm not entirely sure which way this question is supposed to be going, so I'm going to put both of them out. Out of curiosity, could you, personally you, Erin, or possibly could one, code a geometry node that can facilitate or help control the vertex count of a procedural environment or asset?
To control the vertex. That sounds like the decimate modifier or a
So I
subdivide
guess a
modifier.
vertex, a node that's a limiter or a decimator.
I mean, if you're saying, if you want it to, so in geometry nodes, one could code, not myself, a decimate modifier into a node, and that is on certainly a plan that they're that all of the modifiers will eventually become nodes. There's just a certain amount of design that needs to be done for them. I think things like the decimate modifier, it hasn't become a node yet because it's four modifiers itself. It's got like collapse, it's got planar, it's got unsubdivide, and it's maybe got another one that I can't remember. So I think there's a little bit of design. Go ahead, Jan.
Well, I've got another question, but from Nick, Python with Blender, very few courses. Do you have planned to do something in that field?
Well, the aforementioned making procedural weapons in Blender 3 that actually uses Python, and we start manipulating geometry nodes using Python within that course itself. So that's maybe one you want to check out. I will get a link for that for you.
And Mikey has been threatening to do more Python-y Blendery courses.
It's actually on my list. So part of the Blender Creative Suite, which is a large suite of courses, which the beginners course for Geometry Nodes is part of, there will be a getting started in Python module for that. My aim is at the beginning of next year, so sort of like January, February time, for that to be launched. So I'm definitely going to go through that. I absolutely love Python in terms of being able to interact with Blender. It's surprising how many other programs actually have Python as a possibility to interface with them as well. So it is a skill that once you get the hang of BPY, the Blender Python module, that's probably the hardest thing when it comes to teaching Python, because Blender specific Python, yes, you can do your print functions and everything else that was with standard Python 3. The moment you start going into Blender, it's not always clear how you go and get something or where it is. And one of the things that tripped me up like 2.5 years ago is, so if you go into bpy.data, so you're looking at all of the data within Blender and you look at the objects, that is a different objects list than if you access it through another method. And I was comparing two lists of objects that had all of the objects in. Let's say it was bpy.collections.objects. Those two lists were actually slightly different. Not all the time, which was really confusing, because then I had this bug, which wasn't a bug, it was me not programming properly, but I had this bug where it would attach two things incorrectly. And I'm like, but why? But why? And it wouldn't throw up an error because the two lists were always the same length. If one list was like a different length, then I'd have caught it much sooner. But it took a while, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to print everything out, print statements all over the place. I'm like, okay, it's not matching. Why not? Oh, I'm accessing these. So it takes a while to get your head around how Blender's API works, and I put forward that if you're new to coding, trying to read the Blender Python manual online can be very difficult because it's not always clear as to what those things are. And occasionally they do give examples, but they're not grounded examples. They're just like, oh, you could do this. And like, right.
Yeah, it's very difficult to like read because I'm not. I consider myself to be a non-coder. I've been going through Python recently. I can script with Python a little bit. Like the syntax of Python is, you can learn it very quickly.
Yeah.
The actual words that you're allowed to use in the Blender API, I would say that is significantly more challenging. But like you said, like Python, you can interface with Maya, you can interface with Houdini if you're working in 3D
GIMP,
world.
I think, as well.
Yeah, you can do GIMP with Python. You can do any home automations. If you're doing like smart home stuff, you can do that with Python.
You can
just,
interface with Windows.
Yeah, you can just automate your operating system, do Linux as well.
You can even, I've done this. I've got a Python script that opens Blender. It deletes the default cube and adds it back in again. So you're ready to go without having to do anything. I had to. I'm sorry. I had to.
Well, that's one of the nice things about Blender as well. You can get it to run scripts at like immediately, register and run a script when you open the. So if you have a script in your default Blender startup file, you can just have it do a thing that you like to have happen when you first boot up.
Yeah. Which is absolutely. And if you're new to Blender, you might not realize, or if you're very niched in Blender, you might not have the experience to understand that being able to set Blender up slightly differently with one click is absolutely fabulous. So one of the things that I always do, I like working vertically, and all the node graphs, both shade and geometry, they have this horizontal split. And I don't know, maybe someone's working with a vertical monitor who designed that. I'm like, no, I want to be able to see big chunky things and move along vertically. So I'm always, it pains me because we have to do this in courses. We have to show our changes to the UI, otherwise we get bombarded with, what's this? Mine doesn't look like that, which is absolutely fine. So we go through the process, and I have to destroy my setup every single time. Like, move this back around, put this in. But yeah, being able to, or even import assets. So if you want to use Blender in a certain way, but you don't want everything in there when you're working on one project, but when you're working on another, you want all of these assets in. You could do everything from populating your asset browser with key assets, and so you don't have to wade through everything all the time, because I know that's one of the things now the asset browser is a real thing, that it's very easy to end up with too much stuff. You're like, well, I'm working on a hard surface model here, I don't want all of this vegetation, but you don't want to just delete it from all of your stuff. But you can automate that to a certain degree.
Yeah, being able to get on top of your Python stuff in Blender is just, I'm rapidly realizing how much of like a superpower that really is, because you can just, being able to like one-click solution so many things, and like this is the thing that non-3D artists think we're doing, is one-click solutions. So actually being able to live up to that is going to be amazing.
Yes, there is a sort of a mystery
you mean just a
behind
button
art.
that generates scene, and whatever they wanted just appears.
Exactly.
Yes, I mean, I wish it was that simple sometimes. But of course, what you don't see is all the coding and all the thought that goes behind when I say coding, I also mean with geometry nodes or shader nodes, because you are coding. You're just dragging nodes around rather than typing that in. So it's it is still coding. It's just graphical coding, and it does help you a little, because the number of times that in proper coding you've mistyped something, or you've forgotten what you called a variable and you pluralize it, or whatever, all of those go out the window because you can't mess that up. With maybe the exception of, like, if you're capturing an attribute and you name it and you forget what you've called it and you put a capital in, it won't work. But in general, it kind of safeguards you from your own idiocy sometimes.
Logically, it's all the same though. Like,
yeah,
being able to do the Boolean math stuff and being able to do like the attribute interpolation and things like that. Like, you've interacted with it all really as soon as you, especially doing this kind of advanced course. you're interacting with all the stuff that you would be interacting with doing Python stuff. It's just that you're doing it in a way where I really like visual scripting because it's like multiple guess, like, school exams, everybody wanted to do the multiple choice instead of the essay questions. And that's basically the same with visual scripting versus actual scripting. Like you have a list of the options. And if you don't know something, like on the math node, if you're like, oh, I don't really know if I want the minimum or the maximum operation, it's like, well, just try them. They're next to each other. And you can just click through every option until you find something that's going to work for you.
Definitely, I've never done that.
Oh no!
It's one of these. I know which one. I'm not going to think. I'm just going to quickly go through. So that's interesting that you should mention that, because in the procedural weapons course, there was a node that wasn't available in 3.2, but was in 3.3. And I did a lecture and then downloaded the alpha version of 3.3. And I was like, I'm going to show you how to do it in 3.3 now. But you've not only learnt now the Python to do exactly the same thing as what's now available in the node. So that's one of the other things. I think Python, for what we're doing, is a superpower, because now you can actually do some of the stuff that you would have to either wait for someone else to code up or just not have that functionality. It's also a great Python is a great sideways language into GD script as well, if you want to work over in Godot, because it's so similar. It's a very readable language. That's why it's so accessible. If you've got a list of objects, you go whatever you want your thing, call your iteration object, you just go, well, for object in objects. So it's going to say, if that object is in this object, then do the following. It's very easy to write, because if you can speak, and if you talk through it, you often find that your own errors as well as you go through. You're like, oh. Number of times I printed out memory addresses of objects rather than the objects themselves.
Likewise.
Like, why have I got all these 0x and all these numbers? I need another for loop.
Because you're playing noughts and crosses.
Yeah, badly.
All right, well, we have hit the hour. So I guess this is the point where we start asking if people have any concerns, comments, questions, interpretive dances, or jingles.
Yes. So I whilst we're waiting for those questions to come in, so you've been warned. This is your time to ask questions if you've got any final ones. When it comes to sort of coding and working out how to get into Blender, consume content all over the place. CG Python is a great one. Just Python tutorials in general. If you wanted to get into coding, there are loads out there. And it probably took me about 6 months before I had a bit of an internal click, where my brain suddenly got something. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was one of those aha moments. I'm like, oh. And I just from that point onwards, I was able to code. Basically, it's one of the best way I could describe it. It's like a magical moment. I'm like, oh, I had the wrong end of the stick. One of the things I think I was talking to you about this the other day, Aaron, is the naming conventions with things. You cannot trust the name of something describes what it does when it comes to maths or coding, because scientists and mathematicians and they have this propensity to use the wrong name for something. A vector is a great description. So I learned in maths that a vector is a magnitude and a direction. Which I suppose, if you say it was 0, 1, and 3, it's where it is from the origin. But no one tells you that, and you kind of had this head-scratching moment. It's a great example as where a vector can be a magnitude and a direction, but it can also just be a point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In school,
I mean, I learned
really
that from Despicable Me.
Yes. What was it planned that everybody wear glasses?
Yes.
I don't need my glasses. Let me read that question again.
I don't need my glasses as long as you don't mind me bumping into walls.
I can't put them back up now. Mistake.
I should need new glasses. I have to book an eye test. How advanced is advanced in this context? I'm not sure how much I'd learn from this. Probably not going to buy it in brackets.
Thanks, Rob.
How advanced is advanced?
How?
I mean, I haven't taken this particular course, but I would say advanced is the length of a piece of string. Like it's purely contextual.
Yeah. So Erin was
Over.
saying earlier that if you have no geometry nodes knowledge, you'll still be able to follow along with the course. But for me, when it starts to say advanced, a simple thing with Blender. So what we're going to do is we're going to add Suzanne into the scene, and we're going to scale her up by 5, and then we're going to use a decimate modifier. That would be a more advanced course. If I was to do the same thing for a beginner's course, I'd be literally saying every step of the process. We're now going to press Shift A. That'll open up the add menu. We'll now go to our mesh options. It's just at the top here. We're going to go across and down to Suzanne. Once she's added to the scene, make sure she's selected. She will have the orange out. And I'm not going to go through the whole process there, but that's more of a beginner's course because beginners need more hand-holding. You can't just say, we're going to add this, do that. An advanced person doesn't need they just need the context. We're going to add, okay, we're adding. They're already there on the shortcut keys. They're up to speed with actually using Blender. I think that's a fair way of putting it. And Erin, you sure to add to that?
When you say advanced in a course context, I think that's very different to saying advanced in a job interview. Like you can follow through this course, but I don't think that you would. And I would say it is an advanced course. I do have a habit of just telling everybody all of the shortcuts I use all of the time. So hopefully that's not irritating, but I'm just basically dictating what my brain is doing. So when I do Shift A, I say Shift A. But then I think, when you're in like a job interview and you say you're an advanced person at doing something, then I think at that point you need to have like a real proficiency and a fluency to be able to do it in lots of varied situations. And I think an advanced course should help you go towards that situation. But I don't think you should be put off by the idea like, oh, this is advanced. This is like way too complicated. I think it's more something like you're not going to be shepherded all the way through. You're going to be able to follow it and you're going to learn things. And if we touch on something at the beginning, we're not going to re-explain it when we hit it again later.
That's a great example.
We're going to give the example. We're going to make the assumption that you have learned it because we've done it already. So it's not going to be like.
And fluency is a really good way of putting that. I mean, it's a bit like when you're fluent in a language. It can mean all kinds of things, but we're generally going to assume that you can have a basic conversation on a general topic.
Yeah.
You might have a strong accent from another language. You might not know all the words, but you're still considered fluent. Or you might have a PhD in that language. Like it's a really broad term.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a difficult one.
Erin tried to create a character or creature of some kind with geometry nodes, and what were his observations?
That inverse kinematics one, that was fantastic.
Yeah. And the inverse kinematics actually made a reappearance for the Wicker Baby. If people want an absolutely horrific live stream, then you should catch that one. Way back, I did forward kinematics with geometry nodes as well, because forward kinematics is just trigonometry. So I made a spider like in 2.91, I think. So this was like the first version. I basically had cubes and I just transformed them to create joints.
Yeah.
I would say that process was horrible. But geometry nodes has certainly come on. I mean, try to create a character or creature is a big range of things. Like, can you create a photorealistic character in geometry nodes? Can you create Jan's cat in geometry nodes? Who knows?
Or a cube.
Yeah, so I think
mesh primitives cube.
So I think it depends what you want to do. And if you're doing rigging, you're not going to be rigging in geometry nodes.
Okay.
Like, geometry nodes exists in the geometry data part of the hierarchy. It can't be dealing with armatures. It can't do any of that stuff. You can't be doing skinning, and there's a lot of stuff that geometry nodes, it's outside the scope of geometry nodes. Can you create the shape of a character? Well, you can SDF the shape of anything.
Yes. Yeah, that's very true. And you can even get a very high level of definition with that character as well.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately it goes back to what we were saying earlier about when proceduralism is a good thing and why you'd want to dive into it. You can go ahead and make a character just for the hell of making a character. Is this possible to do? You know, it's like the
Mhm.
climb Everest thing. This is going to be difficult. This is not going to be fun necessarily, but it's going to be a journey. It's going to be an experience, and I'm going to go for it. Now, there are better tools, arguably, for doing that. And once there are other, so we talk a lot about geometry nodes and that being like the king of proceduralism within Blender, but there's a lot of other things that you can do that are procedural in Blender. So anytime you're adjusting a slider and that changes something, well, now you can start to use perhaps shape keys instead to morph a character. So if you wanted a character to be lovely and tall, you could also, using drivers and using shape keys, squish them down to short and squat. And that's not difficult to do, and it's relatively accessible. So there are different tools within Blender that perhaps you get to the same level of proceduralism, but with far more control and less ambiguity as to how you'd go ahead creating a node structure to do exactly the same thing that's already available. But I wouldn't downplay the trying to do that, because you're bound to
And
discover and learn so much in that
geometry
process.
nodes as well. Like, this is one of the things about playing that I didn't say before, but especially with a tool like geometry nodes, like it's good to learn by playing regardless of what tool you're using. But with geometry nodes and with other procedural systems, you're going to come across problems that you wouldn't bother finding a way through generally, because the point is they're way too complicated, whatever it might be.
Mm.
But forcing yourself to, just doing it because it was fun or doing it because it was November, everybody should do November this year. You should you're going to come up with making tools, and I think like this is one of the huge things for why I was relatively early on the geometry nodes add-on scene, because I was just making a lot of really dumb stuff in Blender. Like I was just pushing geometry nodes as far as you can push geometry nodes, and each time I would do it, it was like, oh, do you know, actually this thing that I would have never come across had I not been just messing around, this thing could be a node group. And then if it's a node group, this is actually easy enough for it to be viable. And then suddenly you have another workflow that you can lean back on. It's like these tools make it accessible, and you just have to have gone through, like you have to have climbed Everest once to be able to catch the helicopter to the top, you know, like it's that kind of thing. So as soon as you've done it, you can shortcut that very quickly.
Yeah. So there's often a lot of upfront investment when it comes to anything procedural. You've got to do a lot of coding or a lot of noodling, but once it's done, then that's the real power of it, because you can change a few parameters, you've got a whole new scene or a whole new building or a whole new wibbly wobbly monster with inverse kinematics. Horror scene, that's what I wanted to say. That's fantastic. Right. I think it would be a great point here, since I have not seen any more questions come in, apart from a mouse's tail, but I think that was a conversation going on in the chat. So thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Do check out the Advanced Geometry Nodes course. You're going to get so much from it. It's absolutely fantastic. And when you do, make sure you share what you've done so Aaron, I, and Jan can actually see it. As much as it sounds like a bit of a trope at this point, we all love seeing work. It's actually what inspires us to keep doing stuff like this, because it's just fantastic seeing you guys develop and become better coders, modelers, procedural artists overall.
You also bring us challenges that we've not hit before.
Yeah.
Like, you give us challenges and then we work our way through it, and it's like, oh, you know, now thanks to you, I know more about aligning to vectors or whatever it might be.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this evening. I've been Mike.
He's been Mike.
And that's been
And
Eric.
he's been Mike.
Everybody's Mike. Thanks, guys. Right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.
Push it.
Push it.
Push it.